So pleased to be joined by the author of a very unique pro wrestling book, The Six Pack on the Open Road in Search of WrestleMania. It's Brad Balukjian. Brad, welcome to Under the Ring Pro Wrestling Conversations. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Phil. Glad to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate you taking the time for this. I met you in person back at the 80s Wrestling Con and kind of learned about your whole project here. So it's rare for me to find an idea for a wrestling book that's completely unique in the genre. Normally, you get biographies, wrestling for dummies, books of lists, something like that. This is a totally unique concept. So you were going to write a book on the Iron Sheik, proved difficult because of the barriers that he sort of created, and you ended up tracking down six people who wrestled at MSG the night Cheeky won the championship from Bob Backlund. The key moment in turning to the dawn of Hulkamania and really the explosion of the WWE, WWF at the time. What was the most difficult thing for you in working on this book?
The most difficult thing was probably just trying to get to the truth, which won't surprise wrestling fans. But I formerly was a fact checker in my magazine career, and so I had that background. And of course, when you're trying to find truth in the world of wrestling, it can get pretty murky. So this is why doing so much research in advance, interviewing so many sources, um, calling guys out if they were not being, truthful or didn't remember something correctly. Uh, that was a big challenge. Was just trying to make sure that I was getting the story accurate. Another big obstacle was getting some guys to talk to me. As I wrote about in the book, there were some people that wanted me to pay them to talk to them, and that was different than what I had encountered in writing my first book, The Wax Pack, which is where I was tracking down and interviewing former baseball players. And then, of course, there's the Iron Sheik factor, which is the whole start of the book is set in 2005, where I had tried to work with him on a biography that didn't go as planned, to put it mildly. And then, so there was always the question of like, well, would I be able to close the circle and spend time with him again and kind of reunite and get the story that I wanted to get 17 years ago.
And you mentioned it a little bit. Kind of the genesis of this show was that I always found conversations with pro wrestlers to be among the more interesting conversations I've had in my journalism career. But what's your takeaway from interviewing pro wrestlers as subjects? I mean, you mentioned trying to find the truth, and I could totally relate to that. But what's it like for you, and especially in a project like this, interviewing pro wrestlers?
Well, I try to, you kind of have to check your fan hat at the door. I get asked a lot about what it's like to meet my heroes because these were the guys that I grew up watching as a kid in the 80s. Same thing with my baseball book, people with baseball cards I collected. So there's always I mean, you're lying if you say that there's no part of you that's just inside super excited to be speaking to these guys. And they, wrestlers in real, like something about what the TV, what the cameras do to people, especially from that era, like seeing them in real life, it's just almost like surreal that they're like, these colorful costume characters are now real people. Once you get past the adjustment, the kind of shock of that, I just try to approach them like regular people. I think that anyone that's been famous really appreciates that. That's one thing I've noticed in interviewing people that have had some degree of fame is that they just want to be treated like everyone else. And so not, you know, uh, not getting into too much of the fanboy mode, but just uh, having a conversation, asking them questions about who they are. Just again, outside of the ring, the book is really a lot about them as people and their identities away from the ring, how their in some cases their real identities morphed into these characters that they portrayed.
And even sort of the moment in time that you chose to document here is like, the turning point in wrestling. Where everything
Right.
kind of exploded. So your six pack is Tony Atlas, Tito Santana, Sergeant Slaughter, Mass Superstar, Jose Luis Rivera, which was actually the one that surprised me the most,
Right.
And then I guess Hulk Hogan technically, and then sort of the
Iron Sheik, and then
Iron
Hulk
Sheik.
Hogan is the 7th, and then I had a Vince McMahon chapter as well.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Do you have a personal favorite six-pack story from the journey that you want to that you would share? That's
Well, I
even
think,
outside of the book. If you
yeah. I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, some of the stuff that didn't get into the book was fun. Like when I went up to Minneapolis and I was tracing Bob Remus, Sergeant Slaughter's backstory, and he grew up and spent a lot of time in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. And so I was able to find his high school football coach, who remarkably is still alive in his 90s. And I was also able to find some of the people that, I guess I put them in the book a little bit, but that the Iron Sheik trained before he was the Iron Sheik. So when he was just Khosrow Vaziri in the early 70s, training the U.S. Olympic wrestling team. I remember spending time with Kaz back in 2005 when we spent the most time together working on the book project. He'd always talk about these guys like with really high regard that he had trained, like Dan Chandler and Pat Marcy. And you could tell how proud he was of his role as an amateur coach. And of course, later on as a pro wrestler, there were all the different kayfabe stories of, and various, he was in the Olympics or he won a gold medal for the U.S. and on and on. And, there were some of those things that were true. I mean, he really did win a gold medal in the 1971 AAU tournament, but he was never competed himself in the Olympics. But to be able to find these guys that did compete for the U.S. in the Olympics in 1972, 1976. Another one was Brad Reagan's, who he helped work with. And these guys had a whole different perspective on the Iron Sheik than any of the people that knew him from pro wrestling. Like, you interview any pro wrestler about the Iron Sheik and you just get an immediate laugh and smile and stories about, his antics. But these guys that knew him back before he was the Iron Sheik almost seemed like not disgusted, but kind of frustrated by that side of who Khosrow Vaziri became. And they really enjoyed telling stories about what he was like as Khosrow Vaziri, as a coach, as a very serious, hardworking, disciplined wrestler. And a lot of them were just so grateful for how he brought out their very best Greco-Roman wrestling ability when he coached them.
That's really interesting. Because he had he had several different periods of his life that you could really and that's probably why you wanted to write a book about the guy to begin with,
right?
Because you can separate it out so much.
I mean, I think like in a book about the Iron Sheik, the temptation is just to focus on either the crazy late stage Howard Stern stuff or the stuff in 83, 84, which that's the focus of the book. But being able to, again, find his coach, Alan Rice, who was the first person to bring him or to help him in the United States when he came here, when he defected from Iran in 1969, to find him and to actually fact check all these stories that I'd heard over the years, right? Or Jim Dushin, who he wrestled in the 1970 AAU tournament, where Jim Dushin ended up winning, I believe, the gold medal, and Khosrow won like silver or bronze. And to be able to interview someone like that and ask, well, what was he like to wrestle as an amateur? Like, how good was he? Those kinds of questions are things that I had never seen covered in a wrestling book or shoot interviews or anything. And I think that's, I guess, what I'm proud of in this book is there's a lot of new ground that gets covered, whether it's that stuff or it's the people I found who worked in the WWF front office in the mid 80s who had never really spoken before about how they expanded nationally, and talking about those crazy Middle East tours and over to Qatar and Bahrain and Dubai. And, of course, they were just there in Saudi Arabia, a few days ago.
Right.
Very few people know that they were doing that, 40 years ago.
Right.
That was already happening. Or the stuff about Hulk Hogan and being able to go find people he was in a band with. Like, we've heard these stories over and over again about how he was a bass guitarist and he was in Ruckus, but to actually find the guys and interview them that were in the band, that hadn't been done To dig up the lawsuit file that Bill Eadie had where he had filed a lawsuit against Vince McMahon in 1991, for being underpaid basically all those years, and to read the deposition and to get some of the stories of how Bill Eadie pushed back on Vince McMahon, even back in 1984, when he was the mass superstar and why he left the company then, and how much he respected Vince Sr. versus Vince Jr. And then Jose Luis Rivera, who, there was nothing on him that was accurate in my research. So I flew to Puerto Rico and spent a couple of days with him and got, again, all kinds of stories based, why did his push end in the WWF, stuff about Jose Gonzalez, the guy that murdered Bruiser Brody. I mean, all this information that, again, saying something new in wrestling and saying something new that's accurate, I think is challenging. So I think I'm most proud of those, stories, that research, that material that I was able to uncover just through good old fashioned, journalistic practices.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say is, like, a lot of times with wrestling, because it's sort of like my secondary thing that I do to my primary job, but, I'll go down like a rabbit hole of researching something or looking up something, some fact that I want to look up, or you're actually like physically going on the road and finding the human beings to tie it all together. You're like doing the actual rabbit hole that I'm searching. So it's just,
well, I think
it's impressive.
I appreciate you saying that, because that's kind of my style in these books and I do that not just to, get the story directly from somebody, but as a writer, if you read my book, you'll see that, like, I very much am describing the places I go in the first person and saying, okay, this is what this person looks like, and this is what the hotel looks like, or this is where, when I go in the ring for a day and practice and do a day of training myself in wrestling, well, this is what it actually feels like. So, that kind of participatory journalism is not done that much anymore. But it's always what I was trained in and how I like to write. So, hopefully people will appreciate that.
I know you mentioned your other book on baseball before. So what you produced here is basically, to me, literary journalism. I took 2 classes on it in college.
Uh-huh.
So do you have any particular writer or style you try to sort of emulate when you work on something like this?
Yeah, I know. Thanks. Yeah, I my goal is for my work to be literary journalism. I was trained in magazine journalism, which is basically the same idea. Unfortunately, magazines barely exist anymore. But yeah, my sort of literary idols would be people like Wright Thompson, Mark Bowden, David Quammen, and then older, sort of the originals would be Hunter S. Thompson and Tom Wolfe, and kind of the practitioners of the new journalism back in the 60s and 70s that were some of the first people to popularize the idea of using the techniques of fiction applied to nonfiction. So, establishing a scene, having dialogue, having a lot of detailed description, those sorts of things make the writing feel more cinematic and more literary than just a straight research project.
Yeah, when I started checking this out and I realized kind of the direction it was going, it took me back to reading like Thompson and Gay Talese and some of those people in my classes, and I was like, yeah, I can.
Yeah, it's funny.
And having wrestling be the root of it.
Yeah, it's funny because so at 80s Wrestling Con, when I met you, I ran into Tony Gurria, who, and again, so back to your question, like there were several people, Tony Gurria, Jim Brunzell, Brian Blair, Ken Patera, Gene Scott, who was George Scott's widow, who I interviewed but barely got into the book or didn't get into the book. Tony Gurria was one of them, and he was actually on maybe the January '84 show. And when I saw him, I had given him a copy of the book, and when I saw him at 80s WrestleCon, I said, "Well, what do you think?" And he sort of said, "Well." He's like, it took me I started reading it, I just was really confused. And then he's like, once I realized what you were doing, I could get into it. But, to your point that you said leading off the show, it's definitely a different type of writing style and wrestling book that some people might not be used to.
Was there anybody else from the '83 card who you would have liked to have sat down with if they were available?
Yeah, so people ask me like, well, why did you not try to do everybody? And so part of that was, well, a lot of guys are dead, but the ones that are alive, um, a lot of it was space. Like the book was already, it couldn't be any longer. According, my publisher had limitations on that. I was going to do a chapter on Bob Backlund. He's pretty instrumental to the story, and I actually did a lot of reporting around that, where I went to Princeton, Minnesota, and met up with people that grew up with him. But I also found out in my reporting that he's got pretty severe dementia, and so
that's too bad.
That just wasn't going to be an option. So I cut that chapter, and but then there were like people like the Magnificent Morocco and Ivan Putski and the Wild Samoans, where I think there could be some great material there. I think like Afa is not in great health now, but Morocco's out there in Hawaii. He could be great. But I figured, well, I'm already flying to one island to talk to one guy. Like that would add a lot of expense, because in books like these, like the authors, we have to pay for everything. We have to pay for our travel, our lodging. So going to Hawaii is not cheap.
And then in the case of Jose Luis Rivera too, you like more of an under the radar guy. Like you said, nothing you found on him was necessarily accurate. The Samoan story has been told pretty well in wrestling, right, I think, over time. Is there anyone who had passed away on that card who you kind of, during the course of your reporting, you were like, I wish I could have been able to ask this guy a question or two?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who else was on there.
I should have pulled up the card in
Yeah,
front of me. So I did a few days ago, but not today.
It's not jumping. Who I'd like to interview who's still alive is Tiger Chung Lee. I think
interesting.
And he's had quite a lot. I mean, he's in Japan, so that would be pretty tough. But maybe Japan or Korea. But he would be interesting to talk to, because he was there during that period.
Yeah, it's such a crossroads to look at those two cards, and like guys from all over the place kind of realizing like, okay, wrestling is about to explode, and I'm going to be a part of it.
Oh, who passed away is Ivan Koloff. Like I would have liked to talk to Ivan Koloff.
I actually had the opportunity to talk to Backlund right before COVID. I think it was literally the last show I went to before COVID. It was February of 2020.
Okay.
And asked him questions about Adrian Adonis and Jesse the Body Ventura. And he was like telling me about his matches with those guys. And then while we were talking, Road Warrior Animal interrupted us and hugged Bob Backlund. So he's like excusing himself to me. I'm like, you don't need to excuse yourself to go hug this guy. But
he was still in
he absolutely. He was actually booked on the show that night and did a headstand in the ring.
Oh wow.
And the card that I went to was only about, he said it was about 10 minutes away from where he lives. So that was the easiest part for him. It was in Connecticut. So what is it like to have known the Iron Sheik and his family? I know Keith Elliott Greenberg, I think, was also working on a Sheik biography for a time. And do you ever see yourself going back to that project, or do you think it's good where you left it and this kind of completes the circle?
Yeah, no, I think that I was having a conversation with Eric Bischoff not that long ago, and he's like, Brad, you because I said in the book, like, I never got to write the Iron Sheik biography. He was like, no, you wrote it essentially with this book. And I think he's right. I think that that book in 2005, I think would have been amazing, because the publishing marketplace was different back then. I think there would have been a good market for that. Looking back, I wasn't ready at that time. Like, I don't think I would have done nearly as good a job. And I was only 24 years old. Now I just don't think that there's the market for standalone wrestler biographies like the way there was 20 years ago. And I personally feel like I've closed that door, or I've come full circle there. Plus, they had the Sheik documentary. WWE did one on A&E. Keith wrote a great book that will hopefully one day get released, but there is a complete biography that's out there that they just haven't published. But I really treasure my relationships with Carol, his wife, and his daughter, Nikki, who I'm still in touch with to this day. And they were so helpful over the years in supporting me, and especially back in 2005 when Cause was really unpredictable. I didn't really go into detail in this in the book, but I can remember the weekend he got inducted into the Hall of Fame, WrestleMania 21, walking around Universal Studios with his wife Carol after Cause had a little, eruption, kind of tirade, and both of us kind of consoling each other because it could be so difficult. So like I really it meant a lot. Like when that whole weekend, it was just me, Carol, and Cause at the Hall of Fame, and I got to go backstage and everything. I met Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon and all these people. So that was a pretty cool experience.
What's something that people should know about the Iron Sheik that isn't really out there? Is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Well, I think the stuff that I wanted people to know, I put in the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was that, if you read the last chapter, I make the point that because I get asked a lot, oh, what was the Iron Sheik on Howard Stern and on Twitter? Was that really what he was? Was that an act or was that really him? And it's like, no, that was largely an act. The real Khosrow Vaziri is a pretty serious, disciplined, quiet, respectful guy. And so I think you were seeing a pretty exaggerated and substance-altered version in those scenarios that I never particularly liked. I mean, it was funny at first, but then it was like, it just sort of felt like he was being exploited as it went on.
Yeah, he was making money off it, or somebody else was.
Yeah.
Would you write a wrestling book again?
If I had the right MacGuffin, the right idea, the right inspiration, I love wrestling. I would be open to it. I think it's like, I feel like as a writer, it's almost like the idea chooses me. If someone said, oh, what about writing this topic? Generally, it's if it's not something that I've come up with and feel strongly about, I don't want to do it. And that's with any book, not just wrestling. I would like to write some shorter stuff, maybe article length kind of stuff about different wrestlers, especially from this era. I don't know if it'll take the form of a book, but I would love to do more literary journalism relating to wrestling.
Bring back that magazine journalism, but find a digital audience for it in 2024.
That's the hard thing, Phil, is like, in some ways I feel like my career would be a lot more successful if it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's a tough media landscape to make a living at the kind of writing that I do. So there's a lot of things I'd love to do, but is there a platform that's financially viable? This is my career. It's not just a hobby. So, trying to find the outlets to be able to do it is the challenge.
Does it have an audience? That's always my. I mean, I've been working in media for 19 years, so I know the ways that things have changed.
I think, of course, even if it has an audience, what shifted with the internet was that people got used to everything for free. So,
exactly.
When people don't have to pay for content, it's really hard to get them to pay $30 for a book or, $6 for a magazine or whatever.
As a longtime fan, how heartened were you by the response, the critical response to this book? Everybody I've talked to so far who knew about it or knew of it or read it was just over the moon about it.
Yeah, I was really flattered, grateful. I mean, when I started sending it out to other wrestling personalities, like sending it to Mick Foley and Chris Jericho and Bret Hart, the Bret Hart response was just the highlight of the whole process, for him to be so effusive in his praise and say that it brought tears to his eyes. That was incredible. So I feel really good about having gotten such positive feedback. I think my only frustration is that it's sometimes hard to reach the extent of the audience that I know is out there. I think there's a lot of, I'm 43 years old. I think there's a lot of wrestling fans or lapsed wrestling fans who are now in their 40s or 50s who may not follow the product now. So they don't even, they're not listening to a podcast or or so they don't even know about it. And so that's where I'm trying to get it out to a broader audience, which is hard because I still think that despite all the progress we've made, there's still a bit of a snobbery in the mainstream publishing industry about the subject of wrestling, and even more broadly sports. Like I encountered this with even my first book, that like it's a lot easier for the people that run the publishing industry to get on board with history and science and politics than it is with sports and wrestling.
Yeah, I mean I will be honest. That's somebody who's covered wrestling for 17 years. That is a consistent battle that I have waged
Yeah.
for a very long time on a lot of different mediums and all sorts of different content too. So
Yeah.
it's not a new thing that it's just where is that audience for? Some of it ends up being nostalgia, but to me, this was just a strong. At least, like I said, I haven't finished the book yet, so I need to finish it too. But from what I've read of it, it just looked like a strong literary journalism look at an industry that deserved it, and at a key moment in its history.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of my goal in writing this book was to write, and this makes me maybe sound arrogant, but aspirationally, my goal was to write something that would be like the literary equivalent of the movie The Wrestler or The Iron Claw, right?
Mm-hmm.
These movies that you don't have to like wrestling to appreciate, that were critically acclaimed and got a broader audience. So, hopefully I pulled it off, or to some extent pulled it off. But that is the type of book I set out to write versus what most wrestling books are, I think, trying to do.
Yeah. And then the first endorsement that I got was when I was just carrying your book after you handed it to me. About 5 minutes later, I was standing in front of Bill Eadie, and he was like, "Oh, that's a good book right there." I was like, "Oh, great! I just got it."
Oh, that's funny. I love it. Yeah.
So we're gonna move on to something we call the 3 count now. It's gonna be 3 quick questions and your answers. So in the book, the Sheik keeps calling you Brad Balukjian. Did he ever say your name correctly, and did he ever have any other variations that you particularly enjoyed?
No, he was consistent. The first day I met him in 2001, I probably said Balukjian, and from then on, it just made sense to him as Belushi, and I didn't have the part to correct him, nor would it have mattered if I had corrected him. So he would do the, he called everyone Bubba too. So, hey, Brad Belushi, Bubba. It's funny, he'd call his own daughter Bubba, which is hilarious.
Is that like a variation on something Iranian, or is it just something
his daughter said I always thought it was, first I thought it was Bubba, like B,
it's like Baba,
but it's B-A-B-A, and which I think in Farsi is like kind of like little boy, or almost like dude or man, like.
But it just comes out as Belushi Bubba.
Yeah, exactly.
Second question: what's your music or podcast playlist look like when you're on a road trip like this to meet a source?
Well, podcast-wise, I've definitely done some wrestling podcasts. I like the 83 Week. I mean, like the Conrad Thompson family podcasts. And then I've done a lot of true crime because that's what so many good podcasts are. And I don't know if I put this in the book, but I've been open about my lack of musical taste. So my editor at Hachette actually gave me a playlist that he put together. And he edits books by people like Chuck Klosterman that know music really well. So like I'm getting an education in 80s music. I've been playing that song Head Over Heels by Tears for Fears.
Tears for Fears.
Yeah.
Nice. I've actually been listening to Tears for Fears lately after my sister mentioned that she saw him live with my nephew last year. So, and then the last question: what do other parts of your life think of your writing career? And have you ever run into any wrestling fans along the way in your classes?
So like other people So I remember I was in a meeting once. I've taught college biology for many years, and it was my first book. Which my first book is actually even more sort of personal, or I talk about my dating life and a lot more of my own personal life. So, and like in the first chapter of the first book, I end up passing out on the side of the freeway from drinking too much. So it's not exactly the most professional picture being painted. And so I remember I was after the book came out, I was in a meeting with like our school's vice president of instruction and a dean, and we're chit-chatting before the meeting, and like the dean with their eyebrows raised was like, so I read the first chapter in the book. I was like, oh man. It didn't go any further than that, but yeah, I've had students like they've Googled me and then they discovered that like, oh, I wrote this book, and then they brought it up here and there. I don't bring it up in my classes, but if people are interested, I'll always talk about it afterwards. Kind of like when Tito Santana would always talk about, because he taught junior high Spanish and phys ed for so many years. Like in his class, he was Senor Solis. He was not Tito Santana, and he would insist that we're not going to talk about wrestling in class, but after class, if you want to bring it up.
Nice. Well, Brad Balukjian, once again, I'll say the book, The Six Pack on the Open Road in Search of WrestleMania. It's available wherever you get your books. It's been a real pleasure to have you on and trying to get the word out about this book, because it seems like it's a real must read for anybody, especially if you were around in that era. But even if not, if you just like looking back on kind of the honest view on what wrestling was like back then from the people who were there, I think you've accomplished that with this, so congratulations on that, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm actually finishing up my book tour in the next week or so I'll be in Washington DC next Tuesday as the final stop, so if anyone's around, I'd love to see them.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, take care.